Okay guys, so I am going to show you how to take your prepped muslin sample, which you have right here, and do our first 3 stitches. So remember that this piece was 8 inches wide by 10 inches long, and we pulled threads 2.5 inches down, 5 inches down, and 7.5 inches down that go all the way across. We're going to do the first 3 stitches starting with the basting stitch, and then the running stitch, and then the back stitch. So because I drew all over this, I'm going to turn it over to the other side so we don't have to see any of my markings. So this should look exactly like your sample. You can see you can kind of still see through it to the other side, but I've got a stitch pulled here, a stitch pulled here, and I should say a grain line, a thread pulled here. So I've got my 3 different grain lines pulled. So this is where I'm going to sew on these straight lines, okay? So again, the first stitch is going to be the basting stitch, and we can get started with that. What we can go ahead and do, I also want to make sure you know, so this needs to be pressed and nice and neat, which it is right now. I've definitely got some frays on the edges, so if I want to go ahead and get rid of those, I can. Just might make life easy. So I'm just going to go ahead and like cut those off. I'm not cutting through the fabric. I'm just cutting the little bits of frays off so that it's a little nice and neater when we sew, just so it doesn't distract you. You can do this later after the fact, or you can just do it now. I'm just going to get this all prepped and beautiful as best I can before we get going. I don't know how nice and neat that is now. And the rest of the frays aren't too bad. I can kind of live with them. But if you have any frays that are getting in your way and just kind of bothering you before we start, you can go ahead and get that trimmed up and pretty. So now we have this really pretty starting point. Okay, I've also got an ironing board right back here on my tabletop, ready to go. So that's going to be steaming and making noises at us every now and then as I present. But for everything I'm doing, I'm kind of sewing and pressing, always. Those things go hand in hand. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is kind of map out where I want to sew. So this first stitch again is a basting stitch. A basting stitch you're going to use when you're lightly sewing something together. Baste is not a permanent stitch. It's a stitch that's meant to be pulled out later. So it's just a really light, not too tight, not too heavy sort of stitch that you can do when you just want to kind of sew something in temporarily, and maybe you'll sew a real stitch on top of it at another time. So we're going to do our basting stitch at a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to take my clear drafting ruler and I'm going to come to where I have my grain pulled. You can kind of see it here, and I'm just going to mark 1/2 inch places. This way when I go to sew right now, I'm not just winging it. It's just like we've got this grain line pulled, so we've got a perfectly straight line to sew on. That's going to make our life easy. I can also give myself little tiny markings at where I want to stitch, at my actual stitch length. So when I say sew at, you know, a certain type of stitch, so a basting stitch at 1/2 inch, that 1/2 inch is the stitch length. It's sort of the space between one stitch to the next. So from the edge, I'm going to place my ruler on the edge, I can go ahead and make the tiniest little mark with my pencil at a 1/2 inch, and then every 1/2 inch sort of thereafter. Again, I don't want to see these pencil marks. Ideally, they're just for you, so really nice and loose. You can also do this with chalk or something that's going to rub off later. And if you mark, maybe mark like right on top of your pulled grain line, which is your sewing line. That way you can make sure you cover it up. So what I did is I just made tiny, tiny, tiny little marks at a 1/2 inch apart all the way. So this way I am not just eyeballing it. I'm not just sewing blind. I'm going to know exactly where I want my thread to hit every single time. So that's just going to save me a lot of heartache right there. So you're going to take your thread. I've got a big spool of black here, but I actually want you to use red. You can use red or black. I've got some red on a little bobbin wound right here, so that's what I'm going to use. Red or black, something so that I can see it really clearly on your muslin. And then I'll use a hand sewing needle, which looks like a pin, but it has a little hole at the top where you can put your thread, okay? So we'll start by threading our needle. And so the end of your thread, you might want to clip it so that it's not frayed. What I just did was licked my finger, and I'm using it to kind of keep those frays in check. You want to make sure the end of your thread is really nice and crisp so that you can slide it hopefully right through that hole in the needle. Maybe when you're starting, you could pick a needle with a bigger eye so that it's easier to get through. And I'm trying to do this like through the camera, so it's even harder. and then see what happens here. Sometimes you end up getting like some of the thread, but not all. Let me go ahead, what I should have done in the beginning is just clip this to get it nice and crisp and not even try to fight. So if you're struggling to thread your needle, see that everybody does it. It's not just you. Again, I'm kind of licking the end. You can use a little bit of wax, something to make that end nice and crisp. There we go. Oh, no, I didn't get it. I still didn't get it. All right, so you want to thread that needle, pull it through just a little bit, and what we're going to do for these hand sewing techniques is I only want to use one ply of thread. So I'll talk about this later. Often when I hand sew, I might double it up, right? So see how now I've got two, 1, 2. So when I sew, I'm actually sewing with 2 plies of thread. For these exercises, because I want it to be really clear what we're doing with the stitch, I don't want it to be confusing and see 2 different bits of thread. Let's just use 1 ply of thread, which means that you're going to take your threaded needle and pull this tail about 6 inches out and just let it dangle, okay? You just want to make sure you basically hold this so that it doesn't end up falling off. If you end up like holding your needle like this, it might kind of fall and come loose. So make sure you're always holding the needle sort of right there so that that's not coming off and you've got your little tail just hanging. Okay, we'll deal with that later. But that way when we're sewing with this 1 ply of thread. And we can also go ahead and cut enough for our sewing project right now, or cut a little extra if we want. Cut it off of the spool that we've got it on. So I can just sort of like get a kind of rough measurement here, holding it up to where I'm about to sew. You know, that would actually go across just fine, but then I'll even take, you know, maybe a good 6 to 10 inches extra. So we've got some extra. And we'll cut that and we'll get that out of the way. So now we've got our length of thread. I also, for these exercises, I don't like to tie off the end. I want it to be really clear what's happening on both ends of your sample so that you can always unravel it slightly and take it apart and kind of see what you've done. But again, typically when we're hand sewing, and we'll do this later for different things, you would tie a little knot at the end to kind of hold this in place. But we're not going to do that. We're just going to leave it free, okay? So don't stress about that too much right now. So let's go ahead and start our stitch, our basting stitch. And what I'll do is I will come from underneath my fabric just about 1/4 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch from the edge. So see, I'm not, that's where my 1/2 inch mark is right there. I want to come in just a little tiny bit from that edge. We'll even make it tinier, like an 1/8 inch from the edge, 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch from underneath, right? So I'm sticking my needle through the bottom of my fabric up towards me, and I'm going to pull that up. And again, if I'd tied a knot, I could go until I hit the knot, but in this case, I'm just going to leave a little tail of maybe about 1 inch or 2 inches of a tail, just free dangling here. This will all make sense later when you can look at your samples and clearly see how you started. If something gets too difficult, you are welcome. You can always tie a knot, or you can even, I'll show you, I'll kind of wrap this around. I'm going right back through that same hole, and I'm just gonna wrap that around a little bit there, so now it's kind of locked in place. So if that makes you feel better, you can do that. But ultimately, we just want to have this little bit dangling here, okay? So now we're gonna start the actual stitch. So I'm going to put my needle in on my straight grain line right at the point where I marked. That's that 1/2 inch. So now I can see that's a 1/2 inch of a stitch. For the next one, I'm just going to come from underneath again, right through that place where I marked, another 1/2 inch, and I've come up. I'm going to show you on both sides so you can see. So again, I'm going to go 1/2 inch up, that's the place I marked, and pull it in. So as you can see, I'm going to have a 1/2 inch of a stitch, a 1/2 inch of an opening, a 1/2 inch of a stitch, and you can imagine that's how the pattern's going to follow. On the back, it looks identical. It's just sort of reversed. 1/2 inch opening, 1/2 inch stitch, 1/2 inch opening. Okay? At any point, you probably want to check the back to make sure it's looking the way you want it. You haven't accidentally created a knot or pulled something the wrong way. So I'm going to keep going, and then we can keep checking as we go. I also want to make sure I don't have too tight of tension. See, if I pull that and it starts to gather, that means my tension is too tight. I want a nice loose tension. I want this to look like a straight line. Now I don't want it too slack where I've got like that, right, where I've got like a big sort of gap. I want it nice and taut with just the perfect amount of slight tension, but not too tight. So again, with each of these stitches, I'm coming from underneath, and I'm pulling up, and again I want to just keep that tension really nice as I go, and I'll just alternate what I'm doing. I'm going in and I'm going out. Super easy, and just keeping the tension really nice throughout. So again, because I've marked all my 1/2 inch spaces, this makes this really easy, and I'm sewing on this straight line of the grain line that I pulled. So in, out, and notice I'm not flipping over the fabric every time. I'm just feeling with my fingers for that needle to come down. If my fabric gets sort of caught up like it just did there, I just take a second and sort of pull it back out and keep it flat. And as you go, the tension should just slide into place. Again, I'm just going right there. I put the needle through it. I take my hand under. I don't have to flip it over, and I just feel it. And I come from underneath without flipping over, and I stick my pin right up there. Whoops, lost it. This is what happens when you stare through the camera. Okay, I'll try that again. Right up, there we go. Not rip it out. And I come from the top and pull it up. And again, just keeping your tension nice throughout. And I'm almost getting to the end. Got a few more stitches left. And I could check at any point. See, this is what it's sort of looking like. Make sure I don't drop this from this side. And this is what it's looking like from the back. Beautiful, nice and even, really perfectly spaced. That's what we want. When we have stitch length, we want it to be accurate. Sewing is all about exact measurements and actually achieving perfection. If something is not quite sewn properly, it's going to be sent back to the factory, or it'll go on the sale rack for a discount. It's all about getting the stitches perfectly even and in the perfect spot. So you're going for extreme accuracy here. And if I say the stitch length should be 1/2 inch, then every single stitch should be 1/2 inch. That's what we're going for. So that looks nice and neat all the way across. looks the same on the back. And what I've done is I've come to the end. So again, I'm just leaving this here, and what I do, I don't want to tie off a knot or anything like that. So what I can do is on the end of my line here, I'll just come right back through and pull that, and again, I can just cut this and leave a little tail of about 1 to 2 inches. So it's just a little dangly tail. So I am totally fine with that little tail as long as it doesn't irritate and bother you. I don't want it too long. I don't want it any longer than 1 or 2 inches, but I think having that there, it just makes it really easy to see what we did, how we started on either side. So that is your basting stitch. Really simple. So the next stitch we're going to do is the running stitch. The running stitch is identical really to the basting stitch. It's exactly the same. It's just that a basting stitch again is meant to be a temporary stitch that you pull out later, so it's really loose, often sewn at a large stitch length, maybe even like an inch, you know, something really large. We did ours at 1/2 inch, and then for our running stitch, to really differentiate between the two stitches, we're going to do our running stitch at 1/4 inch. So this will be a tighter stitch. This could still be almost, you know, a basting stitch, but this would be meant to be more of a permanent stitch, a running stitch that wouldn't be ripped out later. But otherwise, they're identical in the way that we actually set them up. So let's go ahead and mark for our running stitch right on that line. We're going to get our ruler and mark 1/4 inch spacing. So this will be basically double the amount of stitches. So in theory, this would be twice as strong as something sewn only with the basting stitch. So I'm just going right down and marking. So all of these exercises are getting you to learn to sew, getting you to practice your precise measurements, and also getting you good at reading a ruler, which is another helpful thing for sure. So I've got my tiny 1/4 inch spacing marked, right? Lots of little dots on this line here. So I'm ready to go. I can get my thread. Now this was my old piece of thread. Let's see if I have enough. I might have enough. See how that's like long enough to wrap there? In theory, I have enough. I usually don't like to cut it so close because I don't want to run out. So you could always give yourself again 6 to 10 inches extra. Not so much that it's cumbersome to sew with, but just a little bit extra so you make sure you don't run out. So we're going to start in the same way, right on the edge. So I'm going to get really close to that edge, as close as I can, especially since my stitches here are only going to be 1/4 inch apart. I'm coming really close to that edge, like 1/8 inch in. And I'll come from underneath. And again, you can tie that off if you want to or wrap it around once, but I'm going to leave that little tail hanging, and I'm going to come in and make my first running stitch. So I went in from the top, and now I'm coming in from the bottom, right where I marked. And see how I'm kind of holding on to that tail with this thumb, just so I don't pull out what I just stitched right away. That often happens. So you can just always hold on to it for a little minute until you get enough stitches up, usually just a few, that it's not going to come out anymore. So again, this is just like the basting stitch. It's just a little tighter, right? So here's our big fat 1/2 inch basting stitch and our tinier 1/4 inch running stitch. But otherwise we're doing it the exact same way. In, out, could not be simpler. I feel like this is the stitch, you know, anybody does when they're first starting, or if you're mending something really quickly, trying to do like a really quick hem on your own clothes, or sewing something really quickly. This is not a super strong stitch. If I made it a lot tighter, it could be, like maybe I even did it at 1/8 of an inch or smaller, a really tight little stitch. But ultimately, this can always be sort of pulled right out by one end because it's really just woven through. It's just over, under, over, under, over, under. So it's not really clinging to anything. The next stitch we do is more of a permanent stitch that you would use if you were hand sewing something entirely. This is just going to be a sort of good basic running stitch to kind of quickly bring two things together. And again, your practice here and your focus is sewing in a straight line and sewing at precisely your 1/4 of an inch stitch length. So hitting all your marks. So really take your time and get this right. And if it's not right, just pull it right out and start over, or pull that stitch out that's incorrect and start over. No big deal. I'm almost to the end. Trying to focus on my 1/4 inches, being precise and perfect. Oops. Making sure I hit those marks. Oops. I might come around from this side now that I'm getting close to the end. There we go. Just got a few left. And look, I was just barely out of thread, just enough. So again, I have now come to the end. I've got my stitch line of 1/4 inch running stitch, and it looks exactly the same from the back. This is actually nice to note too while we're looking at it. Remember when I did this sort of demonstration, I pulled one thread. I'm going to just stick that in there for now. This is something you could do too if you want to just put your pin somewhere temporarily. You can do that and it'll hold it in place. But so when I did this demonstration, remember I pulled this 2.5 inch down grain, and I didn't pull this one, I just drew it straight across. And even though I drew it straight across, look how much it's actually off from the straight grain. When I pulled that thread starting from here, by the time it got there, it was actually about 1/8 of an inch to a 1/4 of an inch off grain. So it really shows you how much you can't really eyeball it or just draw a straight line on your fabric to figure out where the straight grain is. The best, truest way to find your straight grain is to pull that thread. But this shows you the stitch. It looks exactly the same on the back. Looks really nice and pretty. You can compare it, basting stitch, running stitch. So I've gotten to the end, and just like I did with my running stitch or my basting stitch, I am just gonna clip that there, and I've got a little tail hanging there, and I'll just leave it. So now we've got 2 stitches down. We got this. We're practically done. We're just going to do one more. Okay, so for the back stitch, we're going to go ahead and mark for a 1/2 inch stitch length. So go ahead and line your ruler up to your pulled grain line, and we'll go ahead and put. Okay, so we've got our 1/2 inch marks to do our back stitch. So we're ready to get our thread and start doing it. So with this one, we're actually going to need at least double the length of our sewing project in the amount of thread that we need. So I've got sort of my needle threaded, and I've got my sort of 6-inch tail hanging here. So aside from that, let's say I've got at least one length of thread, and then let's even double it, and we can add another sort of 6 inches just to be sure on the end. Basically with this stitch, we're going to be doing sort of every stitch twice, whereas with the running stitch, we just kind of wove thread in and out, in and out. We kind of knew the length that we needed. With the back stitch, we're going to go one way and then also back, so that's why we need sort of double. So I've got this really long piece of thread here to start with, okay? If you run out, that'll be terrible. You'll have to add another piece or start over. So try to just give yourself enough thread so that you don't run out, okay? And this one we're going to start a little bit differently. We're still going to come from underneath, just like our other stitches, but we're going to come from underneath and hit our first mark point here at a 1/2 inch, okay? So I'll just start out by coming from underneath right there at the first place that I marked. So I'm going to pull my long piece of thread, and I'm just going to leave a 1 to 2 inch tail just hanging there just like I have. And with the back stitch, the difference is you come from underneath, but then you come back towards yourself. So what I'm going to do is now come backwards on the line and go all the way right next to the edge of the fabric, so maybe 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch from the edge. So it's going to look like this, okay? So we've come back towards ourselves, and I'm kind of holding on to my little tail so it doesn't unravel on me. But now I'm going to do the next one. So I go from underneath, and I hit that mark that I gave myself. Not pull too tight with the tension. So I've come from underneath, and then I go back towards the last stitch, and I'm going to go right in that exact same hole that I came out of before. So it's going to look like this. So they're practically touching, or they are touching. So again, I'm going to come from underneath at my mark point, keep that tension nice, and then I'm going to go back towards that last stitch right in the exact same hole that I came out of. Whoops, make sure you don't catch your fabric. There we go. So it's this nice connected line instead of like a broken line that we have here. And on the back, you'll have these long sort of 1 inch floating loops. So there's definitely a front and a back to this stitch. There's definitely like a pretty side and the less attractive side. So I'll keep going so we can show you. So again, I come from underneath and I go back towards that last stitch into the exact same hole. Come from underneath, and back towards that last stitch into the exact same hole. And this is when you'll definitely have to just like adjust your tension, make sure it's looking good, check front and back. Oh, like see here, this sometimes happens. It looks like I didn't pull all the way. I've got this extra long float. I definitely don't want that. So if that does happen, we can always figure it out, right? This is a good example. So I'm trying to pull here, and it looks like I actually got it caught in the last stitch. So if this happens, you don't ruin your whole project, but I can just come with my pin here and pull out that last stitch and see what happened. At what point did this float get stuck? Looks like maybe it was right there. So I can just pull it nice and taut. Pull that, there we go. And now that looks nice and neat. If you do anything like that, it's fine as long as you catch it pretty early on, because then you don't have to rip out everything that you did. You can just pull out those last few stitches where something went wrong. And this is also what happens when you're working with a longer piece of thread. It's easier for you to accidentally get like a little tangle or to have a loop or something like that happen. So just check the back of your work pretty often. Okay, so now we're back to where we were. We came from underneath, and I'm going to go back into that last stitch. And I'll just make sure to check every so often that I don't get another one of those big loops. So from underneath and back towards the last stitch, from underneath and back towards the last stitch. So I'm just ending up with this straight, unbroken line, and in the back it looks like this. I've got my little tail that I started with, and I could see a straight line, but it's like the thread just seems doubled. It seems a lot heavier, and again, you've got these longer 1 inch floats that are going to be more prone to sort of getting snags or something going wrong with them. So just make sure to check that tension. So I'm coming from underneath, whoops, drop my needle, a little slippery guy, coming from underneath, and back towards that last. Make sure my tension feels good. coming from underneath. And back towards the last. Checking the back every now and then. Coming from underneath. Back towards the last thread or the last stitch. And once you kind of get the swing of it, your hands kind of take over in the motion. It's when you stop for a second that you'll get thrown off. But just remember that you're always coming from underneath and going back into the same stitch. And at any point from the front, you shouldn't have any space. It should be a solid line from the front. And from the back should just look neat and straight, but with longer floats. So almost coming to the end. Come from underneath and back through that last stitch. And then when I get to the very end here, I can come about 1/8 of an inch from the edge to make that the last stitch, and then go back through. And now I've completed. So I can just pull that off. And I've got this nice, long, straight, unbroken line here. Ideally, like you can see a couple of places here where I didn't actually go back through the same hole, I went right beside it and it doesn't look as nice. So you can probably do better than me when you do it. Not try to go as quickly as I was, and same, you can see this here, it's this little bit of broken. So really try to go back through that exact same hole, it'll look nice and neat. And then on the back, it should look like this. It should still look neat, it should still look straight, it's just really thick. It's got you know, several layers of thread over top and these really nice long floats. And so again, my end thread here, I can cut that and give myself a 1 to 2 inch little tail. But I wouldn't really, again, especially on a stitch like this, so that you don't forget how to do it later. I don't want to tie this into a knot or tie it off. I want you to be able to pull this out years from now and look at this and figure out how we started and remember how we started by being able to unravel. So this is what your first sample should end up looking like. It should have your basting stitch, your running stitch, and your back stitch. And once you're done with all your stitches, it might have gotten wrinkly because we've been handling it. So this is where you can take your iron and press it out and make it look gorgeous and flat and neat again. And if you need to, you can hit it with a little bit of steam, and you could hit it with a little bit of water, and see how just by ironing it, I kind of moved my threads a little bit. Look, I can just pull on each end, and I straightened it beautifully. And same, I'll do that with this one. I'll just give my little thread a pull there. Oh yes, gorgeous. I want these to be neat and crisp and tidy, and you'll actually present it like this in your plastic folio page that goes in your notebook, so that I can see basting, running, and backstitch. And then you can also label them. You can write directly onto the sample, or you can print it out with a printer and then like cut it out and tape it in, something like that. But so we'll have our basting stitch, and then running stitch. And I definitely want them labeled. That's going to give you a point right there just for labeling it correctly. And back stitch. And again, because it's so difficult to write on the fabric and not super neat, you may want to print it out and, like I said, just like tape it on or paste it on, something like that. So I want you to present just like this, with them properly labeled and looking just as neat and perfect and pretty, and you'll be all set.